It starts with the quiet hum of a suburban cul-de-sac, just the murmur of concerned neighbors and the sudden pale silence of a patrolman realizing his absolute authority has just evaporated. Officer Robert Barlow thought his gut was the law. He believed his badge made his snap judgments unquestionable. But when he slapped handcuffs on the black delivery driver, barking about contraband, he didn't realize the brown envelope was actually a sealed federal warrant. He just saw another easy target. He was dead wrong. Minutes later, as unmarked federal SUVs swarmed the street, the untouchable officer was the one shrinking under the spotlight. George was on his 8th stop when he saw the cruiser. He had just stepped off the porch of a split level on Delwood Circle, receipt signed, package delivered, and was cutting back across the lawn toward the van, when the black and white rolled to a slow stop behind him. Not a dramatic pull-up. No lights, no chirp of the siren. Just the quiet, deliberate parking of a vehicle whose driver had already made a decision before the engine cut off. Or George noticed it the way he noticed most things on his route, calmly, catalogued, filed. A patrol car, parked close. He kept walking. He was reaching for the van's rear handle when he heard the door. Officer Robert Barlow stepped out with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once doubted that the world would wait for him. He was broad through the shoulders, mid-40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in mild disapproval sometime in his 30s and never quite relaxed since. His uniform was pressed. His boots were clean. He had the look of someone who took the visible parts of the job seriously and had long since stopped questioning the invisible ones. "Afternoon," Barlow said, though it was still technically morning. "Morning," George replied, and left it at that. Barlow's eyes moved over the van with the slow, practiced sweep of someone reading a room, rear doors open, boxes stacked in their zones, the manifest board visible above the driver's seat. His gaze paused, just briefly, on the secure compartment behind the seat. The Velcro strap, the edge of the brown envelope visible above it. "You delivering in this neighborhood?" Barlow asked. "Yes, sir." George kept his voice even, his hands visible. 14 years on the road had taught him the particular grammar of these encounters, the importance of stillness, of not reaching for anything without narrating it first, and of keeping the temperature of your voice below the temperature of the moment. Route driver, 14 years with Meridian Courier. Just finished a drop at 4:12. Barlow nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not really processing what you've said, but want you to think they are. He took a few steps closer, not aggressive, just repositioning. The way a man adjusts his angle to get better light on something he's trying to read. "You got ID on you?" "Yes, sir." "Our company badge and driver's license. They're in my front left pocket. Okay if I reach for them?" A small pause. "Go ahead." George produced both in a single deliberate motion and held them out. Barlow took them, looked at the license first, then the badge, then back at George with the expression of someone who had expected the documents to tell him more than they did. "Meridian Courier," Barlow said, reading the badge aloud as though the words might mean something different the second time. "You got a manifest for today's deliveries?" "On the board, right there." George gestured toward the open van without moving toward it. "I can pull it down if you need to see it." "In a minute." Barlow handed the ID back and let his eyes drift again to the interior of the van, to the envelope. "What's in the secure slot?" George felt the question land the way a change in air pressure lands. Not loud, but noticeable. He kept his expression neutral. "Federal correspondence, sealed package, or chain of custody delivery. I'm contracted to bring it to the U.S. Attorney's satellite office on Carver Boulevard by noon. Barlow's chin lifted slightly. Federal correspondence? Yes, sir. Direct contract through our Federal Liaison Office. It's logged on the manifest. There was a beat of silence, in which a sprinkler 2 houses down clicked on and began its slow rotation, and somewhere up the street a screen door opened and closed, while Barlow looked at the envelope the way a man looks at something he has already decided is suspicious and is now simply building the case for. His expression hadn't changed, still that same settled disapproval, but something behind his eyes had sharpened. You mind if I take a look at it? George kept his voice steady. It's a sealed federal document, sir. Tamper-evident tape. I'm not authorized to break the seal, and neither is anyone outside the receiving office. Barlow smiled then, a small and thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm not asking you to break anything, he said. I'm just asking to see it. It was the kind of sentence that sounded reasonable on the surface and wasn't. George recognized it. He had heard variations of it before, in different contexts, from different people, and it always meant the same thing. The conversation had just become something else entirely. George reached for the manifest board, with the careful, announced movement he had already trained himself to use. I'm going to pull this down now, and handed it to Barlow without stepping fully inside the van. The clipboard was worn at the edges, the top sheet marked with the morning's completed stops in George's neat, small handwriting. Each entry had a time, an address, a recipient name, and a confirmation code. 11 stops, 8 completed. The federal delivery was listed at the bottom, separated from the others by a double line and flagged with a small red asterisk that Diane had stamped there herself that morning. Barlow took the clipboard and read it the way he had read the badge, slowly, looking for something the document wasn't offering. His finger moved down the page and stopped at the asterisked entry. U.S. Attorney's Office, Satellite, 1140 Carver Boulevard. Sealed federal correspondence. Chain of custody protocol. Authorized recipient only. Deliver not later than 12 p.m. This the only documentation you have for it? Barlow asked. That's the route manifest, George said. The package itself has its own chain of custody form sealed inside the envelope. I don't have access to that. My dispatcher can pull the contract authorization if you need it. I can call them right now. Barlow set the clipboard on the edge of the van's rear bumper, without asking. What made your company the one handling federal documents? We have a federal courier contract. I have had it for about 3 years. It's not unusual. Private couriers handle federal correspondence regularly when the volume or the route requires it. Uh-huh. Barlow looked up. And they just trust a regular route driver with something like this? The question was dressed as curiosity. It wasn't. George heard the thing underneath it, the implication that someone like him, in a faded uniform shirt with a worn manifest board, was an unlikely vessel for anything the federal government would consider important. He absorbed it the way he had learned to absorb such things, without flinching, without feeding it. I've held a federal courier clearance for 2 years, George said. Background check, fingerprints, the full process. It's on file with the liaison office. Barlow nodded again, that same slow processing nod. He unclipped the manifest sheet and held it up as though the light might reveal something the paper was hiding. I'm going to need to hold on to this. That's my route manifest. I need it to complete my deliveries. I'll return it. He folded it once and tucked it into his breast pocket, with the finality of someone who had already stopped considering the other person's position. Then he looked directly at George, for the first time since the conversation had started. Not the van, or not the envelope, not the clipboard. George. You seem pretty familiar with federal procedure for a delivery driver. I've been doing this job for 14 years, George said. You learn the rules that apply to you. Something shifted in Barlow's posture then. A slight squaring of the shoulders, a recalibration. It was the response of a man who had expected deference and received competence instead, and didn't quite know what to do with the difference. He handed the clipboard back, minus the top sheet, and walked a slow half-circle around the rear of the van, looking at the remaining packages with the performative attention of someone establishing a record of thoroughness. Any of these other packages sealed the same way? No, sir. Standard residential and commercial deliveries. Mind if I look? George minded. He minded in the specific, bone-deep way of a man who had been through enough of these moments to know that consent, what once given, rarely stayed within its original boundaries. But he also knew the calculus of the situation, the cruiser parked behind his van, the neighborhood quiet around them, the envelope in the secure slot, and the noon deadline ticking forward. You're welcome to look at the exterior of the packages, George said carefully. I can't open sealed deliveries. Barlow stepped up into the van's rear without responding, which was itself a kind of answer. He moved slowly, reading labels, lifting a small box and setting it back down, his eyes returning again and again to the secure compartment. George stood at the rear doors and watched, keeping his breathing even, his hands loose at his sides. A curtain moved in the window of the house across the street. George noticed it. He noticed the way the morning had gone quiet around them, the way the neighborhood had developed that particular stillness that meant people were watching without wanting to be seen watching. He had felt that stillness before. It never meant anything good was coming. He checked his watch without moving his wrist much. 10:47. Carver Boulevard was 20 minutes away. He had just over an hour. He could still make it. If this ended soon, he could still make it. The curtain across the street moved again, and this time it didn't settle back. The woman who stepped onto the porch was somewhere in her 60s, wearing a housecoat and holding a coffee mug with both hands, the way people hold things when they want to look casual, but aren't. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her presence on that porch was its own kind of statement, a witness taking her position, unhurried, deliberate, as though she had seen enough of the world to know when something needed watching. George saw her. Barlow saw her too. Something changed in Barlow's movements after that. A subtle stiffening, a new self-consciousness in the way he carried himself inside the van. He had been moving with the loose authority of a man operating in private. Now he moved like a man aware of an audience, which in George's experience made certain kinds of men more careful and other kinds of men more committed to the performance. Barlow, George was beginning to understand, was the second kind. He stepped down from the van and straightened his shirt. 2 houses up, a younger man had drifted to the end of his driveway, mid-30s, earbuds around his neck, a phone in his hand that he wasn't quite raising, but wasn't putting away either. He had the look of someone who had come outside for one reason and found another. His thumb moved across the screen once, and George recognized the gesture the way you recognize a sound you've heard before in a different room. He was recording. Barlow clocked it within seconds. His jaw tightened, not dramatically, just enough to change the line of his face, and he turned back to George with a new quality in his attention. The exploratory phase of the stop was over. Whatever Barlow had been building toward in his own mind, he was now building toward it faster, with the particular urgency of a man who has decided that hesitation will look worse than action. "That envelope," Barlow said. "I need you to bring it out." "I've already explained the chain of custody requirement," George said. "I can't remove it from the secure compartment except to transfer it to the authorized recipient. I'm not the authorized recipient. Well, I'm a law enforcement officer asking you to produce a document for inspection. With respect, sir, a sealed federal document requires a court order or the direct authorization of the issuing office for inspection by anyone outside the chain of custody. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm telling you what the rules are. Barlow stepped closer. Not threateningly, technically, but in the way that uses proximity as punctuation. Oh, you're telling me the rules. I'm telling you the rules that apply to this package. Yes. The woman on the porch had set her coffee mug on the railing. The man with the phone had shifted his angle slightly, the way people do when they want a cleaner shot. A third neighbor had appeared now, a teenager on a bicycle who had stopped pedaling and was simply standing with one foot on the ground, watching with the open, unguarded curiosity of someone too young to pretend they weren't. The street had become a room. Barlow turned once, a slow quarter rotation, and took in the assembled witnesses with an expression that was almost composed. Almost. There was something working behind his eyes that George recognized as recalculation, the rapid private arithmetic of a man deciding how the next few minutes would define him in front of people who were already forming opinions. He could de-escalate. He could call the dispatcher number George had offered twice now. He could radio his own department's liaison and have the federal contract verified in under 10 minutes. He did none of those things. Instead, he reached for his radio, and the words he spoke into it were clipped and certain, the voice of a man who had made his decision and was now simply executing it. George caught fragments. Suspicious document, possible contraband, requesting backup, and felt each word land with the specific weight of something that could not be taken back once it entered the official record. George looked at the woman on the porch. She was looking directly at him, and in her expression was something he had seen before in the faces of people who understood exactly what they were witnessing. Not surprise, not outrage, just a deep, tired recognition. Not the kind that comes from having watched this particular scene play out enough times to know its shape before it finishes. He looked at his watch, 11:03. The backup would arrive before he reached Carver Boulevard. He knew that now, with the same quiet certainty with which he had known his route that morning, the turns, the timing, the things you learn to expect when you've been paying attention long enough. He stood still and waited, hands visible, and the street watched. The backup arrived in 2 cruisers. They came without sirens, but with lights. That particular combination that announces official business without quite declaring emergency. The visual language of institutional weight arriving to confirm a decision already made. The first cruiser parked ahead of George's van, completing the bracket. The second pulled alongside Barlow's vehicle. 2 officers stepped out, younger than Barlow, but moving with the careful neutrality of men who had walked into someone else's scene and were still reading it. Barlow met them at the hood of his cruiser, and the 3 of them spoke in the low, turned-away register that George had learned to recognize as the part of these encounters he was not meant to hear, but was always meant to understand. He stood at the rear of his van, hands at his sides, and watched the conversation without watching it, peripheral, patient, or the way you watch weather forming on a horizon. The woman on the porch had not moved. The man with the phone had taken a few steps closer, still recording, his posture now carrying the quiet resolve of someone who had decided that what he was doing mattered. The teenager on the bicycle had been joined by another kid, same age, same expression of wide, unfiltered attention. The street had filled with the specific silence of people holding their breath. But Barlow walked back toward George with the 2 officers flanking him at a slight distance, close enough to signal solidarity, far enough to suggest they were still observers. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at George with an expression that had resolved itself into something flat and official, All the earlier uncertainty pressed down beneath the surface where it couldn't complicate what came next. "So I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of possession of fraudulent federal documentation and obstruction of a lawful inspection," Barlow said. He said it the way people recite things they have rehearsed in the last 30 seconds, with the cadence of procedure but the slight over-precision of improvisation. George felt the words move through him like cold water. Well, he had known they were coming, had felt them assembling in the air for the last 20 minutes. But knowing a thing is coming and having it arrive are two different experiences, and the arrival always costs something. "I want to be clear," George said, and his voice was steady in a way that surprised even him. "I am not resisting. I am not obstructing. I am a contracted federal courier, carrying a sealed document under chain of custody protocol, and I have offered twice to have my dispatcher verify that contract. I am asking you to make that call before you do this. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Officer Barlow, turn around." George turned around. He placed his hands behind his back. He felt the cuffs close. 2 clicks, one on each wrist, with the mechanical indifference of hardware that doesn't know or care what it's fastening. And Barlow walked him to the curb and guided him down to a seated position on the concrete, with a hand on his shoulder, not rough but not gentle either, the practiced motion of someone performing a task. George sat on the curb in his faded uniform shirt and looked at the van. The rear doors were still open. He could see the boxes stacked in their zones, the manifest board above the driver's seat, the Velcro strap on the secure compartment still fastened. But everything exactly as he had loaded it that morning. The van looked ordinary from the outside, dents, tape on the rear step. But from where he sat on the curb, it looked like something interrupted. A sentence stopped mid-word. One of the younger officers moved to the rear of the van and began photographing the interior. The other stood near Barlow, who was writing in his notepad with the focused attention of a man constructing a version of events while the events were still warm. The woman in the housecoat had both hands on the porch railing now. The man with the phone had not lowered it. George could see the small red light at the corner of the screen from where he sat, steady and unblinking. And he held on to that small red light the way you hold on to a fixed point when everything else is moving. He thought about the envelope in the secure compartment, sealed, intact, the Velcro strap still fastened. He thought about Diane's voice that morning, that envelope doesn't leave your hands, and the particular weight of the responsibility she had placed in him, and the fact that he had done everything right, every step, every protocol, every careful announced movement. He thought about Carver Boulevard, 11:19, 41 minutes to noon. He sat on the curb with his hands behind his back, and the van open behind him, and the street watching. And he breathed, and he waited, and he did not look away. George's phone buzzed against his thigh. He couldn't reach it, hands cuffed behind him, the device locked in his front pocket. But he felt it, that insistent vibration that in any other moment of the day would have been routine. A dispatch update, a reroute, a confirmation ping. He felt it buzz once, pause, then buzz again, with the doubled urgency of someone who had already tried once and was not prepared to be ignored. Barlow was still writing in his notepad. The younger officer was still photographing the van's interior. Neither of them looked up. "My phone is ringing," George said. "It may be my dispatcher." Barlow didn't look up. "It'll go to voicemail. I've been trying to get you to call my dispatcher since this started. If that's them calling in." "It'll go to voicemail," Barlow repeated, with the tone of a man who had decided that consistency was the same thing as correctness. The buzzing stopped. George counted the seconds the way you count them when you're waiting for something to either resolve or worsen. 12 seconds of silence. Then it started again. Not his phone this time, but the radio on Barlow's belt. A dispatcher's voice, clipped and official, reading out a unit number. Barlow's unit number. Barlow answered it, turned slightly away, and listened. George watched his shoulders. He had learned, over 14 years of reading situations from the outside, that the shoulders told you more than the face. The face could be managed, composed, arranged into whatever expression the moment seemed to require. The shoulders just responded. And Barlow's shoulders, as he listened to whatever was coming through that radio, did something George had not seen them do once in the last 40 minutes. They dropped. Not dramatically, just a fraction, a small involuntary release, the body registering something the mind hadn't finished processing yet. As Barlow's pen stopped moving, his notepad hand lowered to his side. He said 2 words into the radio. "Copy that," and stood still for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then his own phone rang. He stepped further away to answer it, and this time George couldn't read his shoulders because Barlow had turned his back fully, one hand pressed to his opposite ear against the ambient noise of the street. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. George counted. But one of the younger officers drifted closer to Barlow, caught something in his posture, and stopped. When Barlow turned back around, his face had changed. Not broken open, nothing so readable as that, but reorganized, the way a room looks when someone has moved the furniture back to where it started and is pretending it was always that way. He walked to where George sat on the curb and crouched down to eye level, which was the first time since the stop began that he had made himself physically equal to George rather than standing over him. "That was the U.S. Attorney's liaison office," Barlow said, "and your dispatch." George said nothing. He waited. "They've confirmed the package. Federal warrant documentation, active case, chain of custody protocol." Barlow paused, and in the pause was the sound of a man navigating the distance between what he had done and what he now had to say about it. "Well, they've also confirmed your clearance and your contract authorization. I told you that," George said quietly. Not with heat, just with the plain, level weight of a fact that had been true from the beginning and had cost something by not being believed. Barlow absorbed that without responding to it directly. "The liaison office is sending a representative to take custody of the package and ensure the delivery is completed within the window." He glanced at his watch. "They said they can be here in 15 minutes. "It's 11:26, George said. "The window closes at noon." "They're aware." One of the younger officers had moved to the rear of the van and was standing with his hands at his sides, no longer photographing, just standing. The posture of someone waiting to be told what to do next, and not entirely comfortable with the reason why. The man with the phone across the street had not lowered it. The woman on the porch was still at her railing, or still watching, and her expression had shifted into something that was almost but not quite satisfaction. More like the grim, patient acknowledgement of someone who had known how the story went and had simply waited for it to catch up with itself. Barlow stood up from his crouch. He looked at George on the curb, uniform shirt, hands behind his back, the van open and waiting behind him, and something moved across his face that was too complicated to name and too brief to hold. "I'm going to remove the cuffs," he said. George nodded once. "Thank you," he said, because he had been raised to say it, and because some habits are worth keeping, even when the gratitude isn't simple. The unmarked SUV arrived at 11:34. It was the kind of vehicle that announced itself not through markings but through absence. No insignia, no light bar, tinted windows, government plates with the particular plainness of something that doesn't need to advertise. It parked with the quiet precision of a vehicle whose driver had parallel parked in tighter spots under considerably higher pressure, and the two people who stepped out moved with the unhurried confidence of individuals who understood that their arrival had already changed the temperature of the scene before they said a word. The woman in front was somewhere in her early 40s, dark suit, credentials already in hand, not brandished, just held, the way professionals carry things they expect to need. She had the kind of face that had learned to be unreadable without becoming cold, and she moved toward Barlow with the direct, measured stride of someone who had not come to argue, but was entirely prepared to, if necessary. The man behind her carried a document case and stayed a half step back, scanning the scene with the systematic attention of someone whose job was to notice everything and react to nothing prematurely. She introduced herself to Barlow first. George caught the name. Special Agent Renee Caldwell, U.S. Attorney's Office, of Federal Liaison Division, and watched Barlow receive it with the stiffened courtesy of a man trying to locate his footing on ground that had recently shifted beneath him. Caldwell looked at George, then at the van, then back at Barlow. "Walk me through what happened," she said. It was not a request dressed as a question. It was a question that already contained its own answer, and was giving Barlow the opportunity to arrive there himself. Barlow walked her through it. Or George listened to the version. Suspicious document, uncooperative subject, probable cause for inspection, and noted the places where the language had been smoothed, the edges filed down, the sequence subtly reordered to suggest a more deliberate process than the one George had actually experienced. He said nothing. He stood beside his van with his wrists still carrying the faint pressure memory of the cuffs, and let the version exist alongside the truth, which had a way of being patient. Or Caldwell listened without interrupting. When Barlow finished, she was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet the street seemed to lean in slightly. "The document in that vehicle," she said, "is a sealed federal warrant connected to an active prosecution. It contains evidentiary materials and chain of custody documentation that, if compromised, could affect the admissibility of evidence in a federal case." She said it without drama, or the way you state facts that are serious enough not to require embellishment. "Mr. Adams is a cleared federal courier operating under a direct contract with this office. His authorization has been on file for 2 years. Every protocol he described to you was correct." Barlow's jaw moved slightly. "I had no way of verifying that at the scene." "He offered you the dispatcher's number twice," Caldwell said. "That call would have taken 4 minutes." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a true thing landing in a space where it couldn't be argued with. One of the younger officers had developed a sudden interest in the middle distance. The other was very still. Caldwell turned to George, and her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. The professional composure softened at the edges into something more direct, more human. "Mr. Adams, apologize for what happened here today. This office takes the integrity of its courier contracts seriously, and we take the treatment of contracted personnel seriously. You followed every protocol correctly." George nodded. The words were the right words, and they were genuinely meant. He could hear that, and they still couldn't quite reach the place inside him that the last hour had touched. But he accepted them, because they were offered honestly, and because he understood that Caldwell was doing what she could within the architecture of what was possible right now. The agent with the document case stepped forward, and George walked him to the van, unstrapped the Velcro, and transferred the envelope with the careful, two-handed formality the moment required. The agent checked the tamper-evident seal, intact, and logged the transfer in a form that George signed with the pen offered to him, his handwriting steady. What Caldwell had moved back to Barlow and was speaking to him in a lower register now. The conversation turned inward, no longer for the street. George didn't try to hear it. He didn't need to. He could read it in the set of Barlow's neck, in the way the younger officers had quietly repositioned themselves slightly away from their senior colleague, in the small, irreversible geography of accountability beginning to arrange itself around a man who had been certain an hour ago, if that certainty was enough. The woman on the porch was still there. George looked at her, and she gave him a single, slow nod, the kind that doesn't need words, because the words would only make it smaller. He nodded back. Caldwell's conversation with Barlow lasted 9 minutes. George knew because he watched the clock on his phone. Retrieved now, back in his hand, the screen showing 4 missed calls, 2 from dispatch, 1 from Diane, 1 from a number he didn't recognize but suspected was the liaison office, trying the direct line before escalating to the radio. He would return them all. He would explain. He had explained things before, and he would explain them again. And the explaining was its own kind of tax on a person, the repeated cost of justifying your own correctness to people who should have believed you the first time. He stood by the van and waited, because waiting was still what the situation required. Caldwell spoke, and Barlow listened, and the listening had a different quality now than it had carried an hour ago. Then Barlow had listened the way powerful people listen, selectively, partially, and already composing the response before the sentence finished. Now he listened the way people listen when the ground has stopped being solid, when the version of events they carried into a situation has been returned to them, marked up and insufficient. His arms were at his sides. His notepad was in his pocket. He did not interrupt. When Caldwell finished, she waited. Barlow reached for his radio. The correction he radioed in was brief and procedural. The language of official record, stripped of everything personal, the bureaucratic equivalent of an eraser moving across a page without acknowledging what had been written there. He reported that the subject of the earlier stop had been confirmed as an authorized federal courier, that the detained materials were legitimate federal documentation, and that the arrest was being voided pending review. He gave George's name, his own badge number, the time. His voice was flat and professional and gave nothing away, which was itself a kind of answer about the man. One of the younger officers, the one who had been photographing the van's interior, approached George with a department-issue camera and a form on a clipboard. He was polite about it, almost apologetic in the careful way of someone who understood the awkwardness of what he was being asked to do, and was trying to minimize it without being able to eliminate it. And he explained that documentation was required for the voided arrest. Photographs of George, of the van, of the secure compartment, of the intact tamper seal on the envelope before transfer. Standard procedure for the internal record. George stood where he was told to stand and looked where he was told to look. He had spent the better part of the morning being processed by systems that had decided things about him before asking, and this was one more version of that. Or even if its intention was corrective rather than punitive, he understood the difference. He also understood that understanding the difference didn't make the standing still any easier. The photographer worked quickly and without unnecessary conversation, which George appreciated. Diane arrived at 11:51. She came in a company vehicle, a grey sedan with the Meridian logo on the door, and she parked behind the second cruiser with the deliberate calm of a woman who had been managing crises long enough to know that arriving loudly only ever made them worse. She was out of the car before the engine finished ticking, her eyes moving across the scene with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of someone reading a situation in real time. The federal SUV, the cruisers, the officers, but Barlow standing apart from his colleagues, with the particular isolation of a man whose authority has been publicly renegotiated, and George, standing by the van in his faded uniform shirt, phone in hand, unhurt but not unchanged. She walked directly to George. She looked at him the way people look at someone they are checking for damage that might not be visible. "You okay?" she said. "I'm okay," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, confirming it for herself, but then turned to take in the rest of the scene. Her jaw was set. George had worked for Diane for 6 of his 14 years, and he knew that expression. Not anger exactly, but the compressed, purposeful energy of a woman who was already 3 steps into what happened next. Caldwell approached, and the 2 women spoke briefly, exchanging cards, confirming the documentation chain, establishing the formal record of the company's cooperation and George's authorization. Diane listened. I asked 2 precise questions and nodded. Then she turned back to George. "The liaison office is completing the delivery," she said. "The window's covered." A pause. "You did everything right." George looked at the van. The rear doors were still open, the remaining boxes still stacked in their zones, the morning's work suspended mid-sentence for the better part of an hour. He thought about Mrs. Calloway on Fenwick Drive, who would have been watching for him. He thought about the Delgados on Sutter Lane and the water bottle in the mailbox. "I know," he said quietly. And then, because it was true, and because saying it mattered, "I knew the whole time." The arrest record was voided by end of business that day. George knew this because Diane told him, standing in the depot parking lot at 4:15, while the afternoon light went long and gold across the concrete. The formal language was administrative correction pending review, which meant that the record existed in the system in the way that erased things still exist, present in the negative space, visible to anyone who knew where to look. When Diane said the company's legal contact was already on it, she said it with the confidence of someone who meant it, and George believed her, and he also understood that believing her and the thing being fully true were not always the same distance apart. He drove home on autopilot. The van returned, his personal car moving through the familiar streets with the strange weightlessness of a body that has been through something and hasn't finished processing it yet. He ate without tasting. He sat in the chair by the window for a while, not watching anything, just sitting, the way you sit when the day has been too much to organize into thoughts, but too present to sleep through. His phone didn't stop. Word had moved the way word moves now, fast, sideways, through channels that don't ask permission. The man with the phone on Delwood Circle had posted the video before the federal SUV had finished parking, and by evening it had been shared enough times that George's name was attached to it in comment sections he had never visited and conversations he had never been part of. Some of what people said was right. Some of it was louder than it was accurate. All of it was about him in the way that public attention is about a person, using their shape to hold a larger argument, the individual reduced to a symbol before anyone has thought to ask how he's doing. He turned the phone face down and went to bed. The Internal Affairs Review was opened 4 days later. George received a formal notification letter and a call from a department liaison who explained the process in careful, neutral language, thorough, impartial, committed to accountability. The vocabulary of institutions describing themselves at their best, while the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. He was told he would be contacted for a formal statement. He said he would cooperate fully, because he would, and because his cooperation was not contingent on his confidence in the process. He returned to work on the 3rd day. Diane had offered him the week. He took 2 days and came back, because the route was his and the work was his, and he had decided, somewhere in the long quiet of those 2 evenings in the chair by the window, that staying away felt too much like conceding something he hadn't lost. He loaded the van the same way he always loaded it, by zone, of fragile items braced, manifest clipped above the seat. Marcus handed him his clipboard without ceremony, which was exactly the right amount of ceremony. The route was the same. The streets were the same. Mrs. Calloway was at her window on Fenwick Drive, and she waved, and he looked up, same as always. The Delgados had left a water bottle in the mailbox on Sutter Lane, and beside it, tucked under the cap, a folded piece of paper with 3 words written in a child's handwriting. "We see you." Well, George stood at this mailbox for a moment longer than he needed to, then folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket, and finished the route. He was different, though. He knew it, and didn't try to argue himself out of knowing it. The difference wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It lived in the small adjustments, the way he now kept a laminated copy of his federal courier authorization clipped to the manifest board, where it could be seen without asking. The way he had written down was in his own handwriting on an index card in his wallet, the direct number for the Federal Liaison Office and the name of the supervising attorney on the contract. The way he had stopped assuming that compliance was the same thing as protection, that keeping his voice low and his movements careful and his manner cooperative would be enough to keep the world from deciding things about him before he had a chance to speak. It wasn't bitterness. He was clear about that with himself, as in the way you have to be clear about things you intend to carry for a long time. It was knowledge, the specific, costly, irreversible kind that you don't get from being careful enough. The kind that arrives anyway on an ordinary Tuesday, on a sunlit cul-de-sac, while you're just trying to finish your route. He made his last delivery at 3:47. Signed receipt, confirmed address, closed the rear doors. 14 years and 1 day on the same circuit. He got back in the van and drove. George Adams never raised his voice, never broke protocol, never gave them a reason. He just stood on that curb with his hands visible and trusted that the truth, given enough time and enough witnesses, would find its way to the surface. It did. This is a story about what happens when a badge becomes a shortcut, when snap judgment replaces procedure, and when a man's uniform, his clearance, his 14 years of quiet competence, and his own calm words are not enough to stop a decision that was never really about evidence in the first place. It is also a story about what happens next, about the woman on the porch who didn't go back inside, about the neighbor who kept that camera steady, about the federal agent who showed up and said, plainly and on the record, that George Adams did everything right. He knew that the whole time. The question was whether anyone else would. On systems built on unchecked assumption, have a way of unraveling the moment someone refuses to be invisible. And George Adams, on an ordinary Tuesday morning on a sunlit cul-de-sac, simply refused. Not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear it. What do you think should happen next for Officer Barlow? Does an internal affairs review go far enough, or does real accountability require something more? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. Every week, we bring you stories of ordinary people who refuse to be made small, and the moments when the truth finally catches up with the people who thought they were above it. Thanks for watching. Stay visible out there.